So I'm Alexander. I've been with Chris for almost 10 years, doing mostly engineering stuff. When I was muted, I was kind of asking what this is. This is something you would put on the back of a motherboard to mount a properly sized cooling fan for the CPU. So I think I'm going to leave it at that simply. And again, sorry for the glitch with the sound. I just basically plugged and unplugged things, and things started working. So I'm going to try to share what I've learned about Scrum for the last, I don't know, 10, 12 years in something called a masterclass. That's quite a mouthful for a title. But I do have reasons for it. And just like a warning, I do sometimes use humor, which you will see here. I think it's better to kind of warn sensitive audiences. The subsequent slides are, view them with some humor. So why would I talk about something as simple as Scrum in 2022? The thing is this: when I started out, every trainer showed this, and basically this was agile. You don't need to read it. It's the same slide that we see over and over again. There's nothing new about this slide. In my view, what's happened over the few years is agile has evolved slightly. So nowadays, agile contains ship turning. Agile contains living in volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous worlds. Agile is about climbing ladders. Agile can be modern. Agile contains a lot of masteries. And if you grew up in the 80s, you have no doubt played with these dolls. He-Man dolls are super cool. There have been agile transformations. And agile is this. And okay, so I can kind of turn off my trigger warning here. The point is that things have grown in complexity a little, and for people kind of climbing this train, there's like a lot to take in, and sometimes we're unlucky enough, or lucky enough, depends on how you view it, to get everything at once. And if you live in the trenches, at the end of the day, you kind of see that many people, while there are basically all of these slides that I've shown, there are nuggets and many truths to be learned from that, but many people just want to write good software, and I'm still a Scrum fanboy, and I just really wanted to go back to basics and share what I've learned. So that's the thing. I will be talking, I'm going to run a little repetition of Scrum events. In my times, they used to be called Scrum ceremonies. Obviously, I will enrich them with my findings. So of course, I'm not going to read the Scrum guide to you at this point. I'll try to time the break so that it splits the session, just like in our agenda. And I think the parts where I will kind of give away most of the secret sauce is after the break. So that's really where I try to share my experience and wisdom more, so to say. We have a flexible schedule. Maybe I will cover the Scrum Master role. It kind of depends. And Q&A at the end of the session.
So, Alexander, sorry, I will just ask you, do you want us to wait with the questions, or should we type them in the chat, or should people reach out?
That's a good one. If you are alert enough, we can try. If it's a quick question, let's try to catch it. If we risk ending up in religious discussions, because there is some religion in here as well, then let's just moderate ourselves.
Well, we can. If anybody wants to ask a question, you can write it in the chat, and we can take it in the Q&A. I think that's fine.
Would you please help me?
I will.
To kind of get tunnel vision when I do this. So please help me out here. So thank you.
Great.
So my Scrum is very simple. My implementation of Scrum is very simple. It's really a sprint. It's a 2-week sprint. I'll say a few words on why it's a 2-week sprint later. It starts with the planning. This is really core Scrum, but just to kind of get us on the same page. It starts with the planning. It's got the review and it's got the retrospective at the end. Obviously, the retrospective would be after the review because I think you would want to talk about your review. And we've got this magic thing called refinement that somehow enriches the sprint. Now, if you've seen a few variations on, if you follow the evolution of the Scrum guide, you will see that less and less is being said about the backlog refinement. That's very interesting because it's one of the harder things to do, I would say, in a way, in Scrum. But that's just the foundation. So we're all on the same page. In Scrum, we've got a daily Scrum, right? We meet every day to say something and to quote the Scrum guide here. I'm just going to do that 3 times during this entire talk, and this is one of them. Daily Scrums improve communications, identify impediments, promote quick decision making, and consequently eliminate the need for other meetings. I don't have too much exotic to say about daily Scrums. Obviously, we do want to keep them short. We've learned that like the anti-pattern is obviously to talk about what you did during the weekend or get derailed into technical discussions. So really, it's up to both the person being the Scrum Master and the entire team to kind of facilitate away from long discussions. That's nothing new. We do have different fashions to actually talk about the board itself, our tasks. And the simple one is basically if a person will have a task on a Scrum board and say a few things about the task and what's to come or not. The alternative is to kind of walk the board. You look at the board and see what's being done. In the past, I would say we did focus a lot on the 3 questions in Scrum. And the interesting thing, as Scrum has evolved, things have happened to those 3 questions. So like 20 years ago, they used to sound basically something like, and please don't quote me here, but it's something like, what have I basically done or contributed with yesterday, what I'm going to do or contribute with today, and are there any impediments, so to say. And this is more like an individual accountability project perspective. Then we had an era during which the sprint goal was very much in focus in Scrum, like I think, let's say 5 years ago, maybe. So those questions would be, how have I contributed to the sprint goal? How will I contribute to the sprint goal, etc., etc. The latest version of the Scrum guide talks a lot about the product, and I would get philosophical here. Not everybody's actually working on a product. Some people are just doing stuff. But now the 3 questions are centered more on the product, obviously not the impediment one. My key finding here is if you start doing Scrum, you really want those questions. If you're not starting out, the big thing is really, at the end of the day, the purpose of this meeting is to have your team synchronized, to avoid duplication of efforts, to avoid getting stuck. And I would say this is the best meeting, because many teams would have this meeting during early morning. It's the best occasion to ask for help and to plan. If you do have any pair programming sessions or mob programming sessions to come, this is where you would plan them. This is where you would plan your breakout architectural sessions. I don't not agree with the Scrum guide here saying there's no need for other meetings. Well, depends on how you define meetings. But if you want to talk about architecture, want to do some spike, collaborate somehow, this is a good meeting and good occasion to have those discussions. So questions, super for new teams, seasoned teams would synchronize and kind of self-organize, and that's a big thing. The backlog refinement. Now the backlog refinement is the interesting one, because again, I was a bit surprised to see it in the Scrum guide. It gets less and less attention. In a previous version, like from 5 years ago of Scrum guide, there was some kind of pointer saying that refining the backlog would, I think it said something, it should take no more than 10% of your total sprint time or something. Now, basically, this pointer is gone. So there is, if you're just reading the Scrum guide as a new participant, a new person to Scrum, you may not actually learn what a backlog refinement is. And I've seen like two needs for a backlog refinement. And if we kind of really zoom out, what do we want to achieve? So our next sprint will start with the planning. And if we are a team of a few people and we are an effective team, that planning will require all our time, concentration, and effort. What we don't want to do during this planning is kind of get back into discussions about priorities, about sizes, about what to actually do in the grand scheme of things. This should kind of be handed to us, or we should at least prepare it to that degree. And that's one purpose of a backlog refinement, really to make sure that the top of the backlog, because as I kind of expect the audience to know, we do have two backlogs, like the big backlog and the sprint backlog. And this, in my pictures here, we've got the Scrum backlog, and we want a successful refinement. If we refine our backlog successfully, the top of the backlog will be prioritized. It will be estimated, and it may be some kind of rough estimation, but we basically want to know if things are big and if they're or if they're small. And obviously, if they're big, we want to kind of break them down again. And I would say that if I were to give some advice to new teams on what to do here, I would want a definition of done to be present after backlog refinement on all items that we kind of expect to go into the sprint. And you can argue that being as thorough as working out the definition of done is a bit premature. However, I found that having those discussions will certainly help you estimate and even prioritize. That's what you would want to do to have a definition of done in place. One thing about definition of done, you don't have to be religious about this. There's no magic thing about definition of done. You can have you can communicate in terms of how to demo. You can communicate in terms of acceptance criteria. That's also fine. The point is that you want to have a clear end state of what you want to achieve with a certain story. And these are like 3 ways of achieving it. They will help you estimate it. So that's like one part of the backlog refinement. The other part is, if you kind of get very good at this, at refining the top of your backlog, you may lose the bird's eye view perspective. And that, I would say, is the other purpose. To sometimes look at the entire backlog, because an active team with lots of inputs will have all sorts of stuff in the backlog, and you do want to kind of prune it, you want to organize, you want to prioritize it. And I would say this is a different meeting. It is backlog refinement, and if we get very Scrum technical, backlog refinement isn't a Scrum event as such, so the guide doesn't really tell you what meetings to have. but it's a different activity. There may even be other people, the product owner or other stakeholders may be present in that meeting. But you want to have a strike a balance between both, because you want to prune your backlog. How to do it and when to do it is also something. If you visited quite a few Scrum teams, you will see all sorts of variations here. You can be mechanical, and that's my advice for new teams. Just be mechanical, book it, have it once per sprint, or once every week, kind of depending on the length of your sprint, and how productive you are or how big the team is. But just like have a scheduled meeting. You shouldn't be able to fail there. I've heard stories about these things taking place during lunches. I wouldn't recommend that. I want to eat my food, but that's up to you. And one thing that I've seen many successful teams do is to have some kind of degrees of freedom here. You do want your product owner to be able to pop into the team or like book a meeting with a rather short notice saying like, hey, I've got a few stories. I would want them estimated because they have ended up on my radar, and would you guys please help me out, give me a blink estimation. So that's like a third kind of backlog refinement activity, which I would really recommend your team to. If you're not doing that, just be open to it. That's a great way of filling up your backlog. So that's that for the refinement. Plannings have become very interesting during Corona times, and as we go break as we break apart into remote work, plannings have become very interesting, because the archetype of a sprint planning, if you see a picture of a sprint planning, I didn't want to violate any copyright rules here, so I had to draw it, but you see people engaged around these stickies, shuffling stickies back and forth on the table, and the energy level is up there, super high. And I haven't had the luxury to experience this kind of energy in sprint plannings, and especially now with distributed sprint planning. But we'll get to that. So the sprint planning, I mean, the output of a sprint planning would be obviously a breakdown of work, and technically what we do is we divide a story into tasks. Now, actually, the Scrum guide doesn't say anything about that, but that's what people do. So I hope that's not very controversial. So that's what you would do. And also, what's been important is having a sprint goal. And I'll get to sprint goals later, but you theoretically you want a sprint goal, and those are like the hard outputs. The not so hard output is basically to kind of give the estimation on how much you really believe in achieving during the sprint. And something I kind of just want to highlight, which is I think it's kind of obvious, but I like saying obvious things, that if you've got a cross-functional team that works in a DevOpsy way on something, it can be a product, it can be a bunch of products. Not everything that will go into your sprint will be a user story. There will just be like a bunch of activities, like stuff that need to be done, and they would go into the planning as well. And it's not the end of the world. You want transparency. You want to be able to get a notion of your actual capacity. So like, not everything is a user story in real life, and that's perfectly fine. Now, the biggest challenge in a sprint planning, and this you see this as you introduce Scrum, and you can actually, I've seen this in many teams, and I think that's like the true purpose and challenge in a sprint planning is actually to create this shared understanding of what to do. And it's not as easy as you might think. I personally, whenever I run a Scrum Master role, I see this as one of the absolutely biggest challenge, because On the average team, on the average Scrum team, you will have developers of different developer, like technical seniority. There will be juniors, there will be seniors. There will be people who have worked like for a decade in the company, and there will be contractors or newly hired people. Um, and there will be actually also be team members who have just joined the team. They may know the company, they may not know the culture, but they don't know the team. And suddenly you've got this quite a narrow window. Do keep in mind that I'm an advocate of 2 week sprints. You've got this narrow window of let's say 2-3 hours to plan those 2 weeks to a super detailed level so that everybody really understands. And like my personal goal, when I say common, like shared and common understanding for a sprint planning, is basically to reach a level where every person can work on any task. You would just take a task from the Scrum board, and of course you forget things. You need to maybe ask somebody or consult something that's been written down. But basically, you can pick any task from the Scrum board and start working on it. It's not like you've totally missed the train. So that's the goal. That, and I should say here that successful teams that I have watched and been part of have reached. And pretty much every bit. I'll get back to you too. So how do you actually achieve this plan, this shared understanding? And this is where this sticky metaphor or this sticky scene breaks down, because I've seen that in order to do that, you don't need to be afraid of having a computer in the room, even if you're not distributed. Having a screen in the room is not bad. What you obviously don't want is like a person typing something in, let's say, Jira, 5 people sleeping. You don't want that. But a computer is a fantastic tool for that, because it lets you read like true user requests. If there is like a product owner has some kind of user request, some kind of feedback or something, you can show that. I would say clicking around in the system, it's fantastic if you've got new people or junior people or some functionality which is a bit obscure. You really want to run the system, not just rely on talking, waving your arms like I do here. You want to click around in the system to see, okay, so we are to alter this screen to achieve that. Okay, so let's fire up the system, see what that's going to look like. Actually, I would say good teams will read the source code. Again, to kind of get a feeling for, okay, so is this good code? Is this bad code? How does it fill our architectural patterns? And again, you would need a screen for that. So the computer is your friend here. Don't be afraid, but don't have one person working on Jira and everyone sleeping. Don't do that. So these are things, and my point here is go detailed, go deep in a sprint planning. You will learn at the beginning. This might be slow. It might feel kind of a bit cumbersome, but as you get the routine, go as deep as you need to get it to really develop this shared understanding. As either a colleague or a Scrum Master, you can kind of like double check, acknowledge. If you see a person zoning out, obviously without singling that person out, kind of have someone on that person retell, how would you accomplish this? Like, you do want to actually you want to check for understanding. That's an active act of, and just kind of train people to be prepared for this question. And something which I've also seen works very well, especially for teams that are new and who are not used to breaking things down into tasks, is to kind of run something which is similar to scenario-based evaluation. You take all the, like you talk about your story, you browse the source code, you run the system, and hopefully outcome come a bunch of stickies, do this, do that, do that. Then what you do before you kind of close this story and consider it planned is really to just talk through, walk through all these stickies and see, do they add up to this story? Or have you forgotten like your end-to-end tests, or have you forgotten tweaking your Docker file or whatever you do? But just like dry run the sum of your stickies to see if they add up. So that's what you do. Sprint goals. Here I'm kind of stating my bias. I'm not a big fan of sprint goals. I find them very, very hard. And that's the thing. If you are a team that works on a very specific product, you've got very specific product management. Finding sprint goals is super easy, actually. That's trivial. If you are a team with a slightly broader responsibility that has to do sometimes like a bunch of stuff, it's hard. And our trainers at CRISP used to call these sprints tutti frutti sprints because it would be a little of everything. And I think they were very, very truthful. However, I've been pondering sprint goals for a while, and the sprint goal itself is not really important in itself, I would say. And this is where religion comes in. What is important is to be committed to especially the upper part of your sprint backlog, and that's where you would swarm. That's where stuff is happening. You are committed to stuff that you are doing and not spreading yourself across the backlog. You're talking to each other. You're kind of delivering together. That's what the feeling you want to create, not like tick off a goal in itself. A few words on remote plannings. So most of us are sitting remotely now, and there will be a computer in the room. So that's good. There will be many computers in the room because everybody needs one. So we don't have the problems of browsing source code or working the system because everybody can show the screen. However, again, how do you avoid a situation where one person types in Jira and everyone is sleeping? You can actually split, you can actually assume different roles in these remote meetings. And these are just suggestions. I have found them to be useful. So do as you please, but kind of divide your work. Let one person keep track of time. It could be the Scrum Master, it could be someone else. Let one people, I find it very hard not to edit any issues, like you do type away in your favorite ticketing system, CCC, card conversation and so on. And at the end of the day, you want to note down the result of your collaboration and conversation on the card, and that's what you would start typing things. Have a person do that. One person keeps track of time, the other does that. A third person kind of may look through cross-reference things in your architectural documentation, in your backlog. A fourth person could be finding stuff in the source code in the system, and you would be juggling your screen sharing, but that would keep you engaged. And
I want to say I'm the timekeeping person here. So
yes,
I just want to
know.
mention.
And I see the clock, and I'm gonna hit the break, but you did talk for a few minutes. So I'm gonna take those minutes.
Go ahead.
And just talk about the retrospective because I don't have that much to say. You're a fantastic timekeeper. So a few words on the reviews then. So that's the planning. The reviews, it's super interesting. The Scrum Guide has turned it into a working session. Many new teams just start out doing a demo. and that's okay. You can do a demo. It will evolve into a review. There is a difference between a demo and a review. A demo is really the team broadcasts. It tends to focus on its delivered features. You run the risk of having a passive audience. If you're broadcasting, that's the risk. And maybe you don't have that many stakeholders. In a review, you would want more people. And what typically happens in a good review is that the audience is active. You may have like a product manager or an active product owner and who kind of talks about how your delivery has impacted the product. The team that I'm a part of right now actually uses the review as an arena for stakeholders who don't meet very frequently, and that's quite magic because there are people they're actually not speaking to each other. It's not like they're not friends. It's just that they do different stuff. And during our demos, they come together and say, "Oh, I work with transmission. This is a cable, and this is a routing. And here, do remember the performance here. And somebody took down an antenna and stuff like that." And it's really interesting to kind of see all of this come together. A review is a fantastic weapon against traditional project managers because it provides transparency. Everybody knows what you're doing, and in this light, I would say, unless you're super new and run risks of failing your demos, like badly failing your demos, invite as many people as you can to the sprint review. Have it optional, but invite as many people as you can. Invite managers, obviously, to create positive pressure. It's not in the Scrum guide, but hey, if you invite the department manager, you want to have a good review and demo. It also neutralizes politics. Don't invite the CEO if it's your first sprint. And one thing I cannot overstate here, whatever introversion you're having, whatever introversion issues you're having as a team, leave them at home during the review. I mean, this is where you shine. This is what you prepare for. You practice for it. You've got cue cards. You prepare your slide deck, your PowerPoint to explain it to people who may not be super familiar with your work or product. Do that, but be extrovertial. Be proud of your work. Don't mumble. Don't see this as a punishment. This is your time to shine. And if people don't show up for this, you're either not relevant, that's bad, or you're too far away from your users. So, okay, thanks for sticking with me, and I hope I haven't oversold the second part. But eventually, as I said, I am a Scrum fanboy, and what's been keeping me kind of loyal to Scrum is, in a way, a magic component. That's what I would say is the essence of Scrum, and it's really the time boxed sprint. And I would like to share some perspective of how important that is and how you can make it work to your advantage. So. In a way, I'm also super happy to be able to piggyback onto Henrik's talk that said we integrate every week, and that we don't, and that makes us not making too big a mess out of things. And this time box sprint is really super because it provides focus to our delivery, and that's super important for new teams because it's truly like the make or break activity to be able to deliver something in 2 weeks. It also gives us a cadence for improvements and our quality work, and it gives us a chance to talk to our stakeholders, which is super important in Scrum. Because I've been talking to a colleague, I know they are super good senior people, and he said, well, we're doing this Kanban. We don't need this 2-week cadence. We are delivering stuff, obviously. We don't need all that. And I asked him, how do you interact with your stakeholders, and he said, well, we talked to them, and I said, how many of them? And there was room for improvement there, I would say. And the magic of this short cadence, and that's what I propose, like 2-week sprint, or the shorter the better, is that it really forces you to wrap everything up. And my recommendation is to like really deliver at least every sprint. Don't make it according to Scrum the guide, that would be a business decision, but make sure to do that. And here are some perspectives on doing that. So if you're a new team starting out, as you see, I like to joke about, a little about management literature. A team starting out doing sprint, doing Scrum, and it doesn't matter if it says 2 weeks or 3 weeks here, it will most likely fail its first sprint. So what's happened is everybody will start hacking away, and boom, things will fail. And this is where you basically call in sick, or just say, hey, we had a sprint 0 or something. As this team learns a little, it kind of understands that you cannot create such big a mess here. You need to do something. You need to wrap things up here, and that's like one of the first learnings of doing Scrum. And such a team will end up here. So, and this means basically that you're kind of ready to have a demonstration, kind of ready to show something during a sprint review, but not. So this is where you would demo on a developer's machine or run a PowerPoint demo. After a while, you kind of don't like doing PowerPoint demos, and you actually hit a good, like, do a first good review, do a good first demo. And what I'm trying also to illustrate is that you kind of take smaller steps with how much you bend or break your code. A fourth stage of this is actually delivering, playing it kind of safe, and really improving the state of the system. Because if you're here, you've just barely, like, this is, if the demo is on Friday 1 o'clock, at this point you kind of tested it 11 o'clock, that before lunch. So this is cutting it dangerously close. A better team will kind of start making messes as they go, but they will converge more often and end up with something that's really of good quality. Finally, this is the pattern, I would say, and excuse me, this is not very mathematical, I know, this is freehand drawing, so please excuse that. But the pattern, like really good teams are having, is that they're running like a good system, and sometimes some boo-boo happens and they need to deep dive and fix things. And they run things up here, and something happens, and they play it safe and end up with a good demo. The point here, and I'm very happy that the Scrum Guide has kind of started emphasizing this, that such a team working like this is most likely running continuous delivery. So obviously you're not waiting for 2 weeks to deliver code, because you're in such a good state here. Okay, so this is a mistake or something, it's a big refactoring or something, whatever, it doesn't even have to be a mistake, but you will be up here quality-wise, and you can deliver on a daily basis here. And the Scrum Guide has evolved to tell us that it's perfectly acceptable. You don't use this as a toll gate for anything. Another view on these 2 weeks is actually how you play Scrum in the long run. So imagine you've got your 2 weeks, you've got a certain code quality, velocity, and of course this can be team satisfaction. These are just some random metrics. So there can be others, but the way you need to work with this 2-hour cadence is to play it both strategically and tactically. So you've got your improvement process, like your retrospective, which will tell you that you want to do something which will improve your stakeholder interaction or code quality to a certain degree between this sprint and that. And the trick is to like play this for years, play this game for years. You need to be sustainable, whatever, and that's one dimension of sustainable pace. Whatever you do, you kind of have to remember that you can make it, you don't have to, but in Scrum you can make a mess for 2 weeks. But towards the end of those 2 weeks, you want to release into production and you want to improve stuff. And as time goes by, this is number of sprints. At least if you have a stable team after a year or 2 or 3 or whatever, at least you don't want these things to drop. Like maybe you do have your like a super good quality work. You've got all your test automation, you've got all your test routines, and you don't have that many improvements. Of course, you also have improvements, but at least you don't want things to drop. That's the thing. So you chunk up your reality in these 2 sprints, and you need to close whatever mess you're making. You need to make it go away in basically 8 days, and that's super important. And you need to do it in a way that's repeatable. That's the challenge for with this sprints. Another thing you can see is, and this is quite fascinating, when I visited new teams, they struggle with finding what would that delta be, what would the improvement be here. And actually, and this is a true story. Some new teams or some teams starting out with Scrum don't know what a reasonable improvement in a retrospective is. I would say that the magic here is to kind of figure out, if we had an adventurous, if we have been doing something like this, why were we here, and how can we avoid this drama, this magic? What's the biggest obstacle happening here? And then if you have this view, now not thinking about how can we improve, and then you find a bunch of random improvements, like really think what could prevent us, what could kind of reduce the drama here, reduce the uncertainty or whatever. And if you have this mindset, you can be quite mechanical. And I was actually enjoying myself writing this list. This is just a couple of ideas of things you can do to reduce your drama. I think I've tried all of them at some point, but these are just ideas. If you don't know what to do to move from one sprint to the future sprint in a better state, these are things you can do. And this is something you can do with your code and system. This is something you can do with your team, and this is maybe something even further outside your team. There's a lot of things to do here. Now, for some behaviors that I've seen either good teams have, or teams that weren't that great lack. And these are, I wish they were 10, because every list, good list is 10 behaviors, but these are behaviors that are important, I would say, when running Scrum for good teams. And I'll make a few remarks on them. So the first one I kind of addressed already. I cannot emphasize the importance of running short sprints. The Scrum guide says up to 4 weeks. I mean, that's integration hell. I mean, how would you dare have unreleased code for 4 weeks? No way. But jokes aside, I mean, short sprints let you get feedback often. You cannot break too much. You will meet your stakeholders sooner, and actually your plannings will be simpler. Also, I mean, everybody who has run a planning for like a long sprint for a large team knows that it's a really hard, it's really painful. You really need to sleep and eat sugar and whatever. It's hard. So short sprint, short planning, short sprint planning session. Fantastic, good stuff. Also, in hostile environments, running short sprints is kind of good because it exposes the team's work to others, and everybody will see that you're doing stuff, and then people don't need to come to you and ask you about what you're doing. So you're avoiding politics also in hostile environments. So that's another benefit. And also, of course, there are some, as I said, purely technical reasons for you can't break too much in 2 weeks. Make sure the team has autonomy. And what would you mean by that? I've got a slide. I don't have too many slides, but this is actually based on a true story. It's really hard to do Scrum if you're in a situation like this. You can, these colors don't really mean anything. It's just different variations of red. You can decide on your architecture. You're coupled to other teams' releases. You don't have a test environment. Your tooling is owned by another team. You can't really access like a production environment, and you've got all sorts of artificial or actual dependencies to other teams. Now, the observant onlooker here would say all of this can be and should be fed into a retrospective, but there are actually organizations which are basically ironclad around this. And of course, as a good and motivated team, you can attack these things, but it's really, really hard. So if you're some kind of manager, engineering manager, or someone with the mandate to affect these things in part, if you want to kind of unleash the power of Scrum, you want to get rid of these things, or at least minimize them. That's where your Scrum will shine. Maybe I'm making a strawman argument here, but we often learn about the cross-functional teams. And sometimes I hear that, and this is a very common question in a Scrum fundamental training, is like, what does cross-functional mean? Does it mean that everybody must do everything? And the trainer will diligently say, no, of course not. But, and here's my strawman argument, what would happen if you had a team like this, if you were to deliver something with these competencies? You had a super UI designer, a super tester, super DBA, super developer, and super DevOps person. Even if these people were kind of T-shaped or pie-shaped, or the T with the hanging little stalagmites or stalactites or whatever, I think it's stalactites, I don't know. This would not work in reality, because as you have an engineering sprint, the amount of work cannot be divided by 5, right? So there will be always more of a certain type of work. And the controversial part here is that for teams that have been truly successful, they have developed the inverse of the T-shape, which meant that people on those teams knew pretty much everything except for one area. And this, they don't tell you this in a Scrum training, but this is just something I have observed. And that means, in turn, if you develop your colleagues and your team to that degree, it can be done. It means that you can really pick, as I said, it ties in with the sprint planning. You get a shared understanding. Every person can pick every task off the Scrum board. So that's where you want to be, and you can do DevOps, you can do whatever you want. But this is my take on cross-functional behavior, and this is either it's a strawman argument or it's a bit controversial. I don't know. Though a fantastic way to actually build this inverse of a T-shape is to swarm on stories. Do not kind of let people diverge and spread across the board and work where they are comfortable. Do mob programming, do pair programming, work on the story with the highest priority, and swarm there. It's a pattern from Scrum, like really swarming, and that's the simplest. It's not simple in any way, but it's a simplest way to actually achieve this inverse T-shape. An excellence culture, that's quite a mouthful, but like an engineering culture is a must. Again, relating back to this slide, if you let your code rot, if you don't have if you don't refactor, if you don't clean up, these metrics will not go up, they will go down. So it's kind of obvious that you need to do this. But if you are asked as a Scrum Master or a member of a team, why is this important? That's why it's important to so that you can maintain and increase your pace. For the same reason, you need to test automation is a must also. I mean, imagine in the first sprint you deliver 3 features, in the next you add another 3, and in the third sprint you've got 9 features, and you need to do regression testing on that. I mean, that's just a sanity issue. This one, don't discuss the story's implementation details. If you listen to Uncle Bob, this is that obvious to him. You may challenge this statement saying that this is about reducing transparency. But all I'm saying here is that if you are a team and you're negotiating a size of a story, do take testing, do take refactoring, do take automating into account as you estimate the size of the story, and don't make them negotiable, because that will hurt your 2-week this sustainable game in the long run, your long run game. So they're just not so never bring them up. That's just part of the craft. The development team owns the backlog, and by that I mean that, again, in the name of transparency, the PO wants stuff, wants product-related stuff. Like, so it's A/B test, user request, regulatory requirement, or stakeholder whims. As a team, you also have your radar. You do want to upgrade the server, you want to replace a component, you want to modernize some language, some app server, whatever. These are things, these are not the kind of things users should kind of sneak away. You should be transparent with those things. But the good Scrum teams that I've seen, for them this is natural, that the backlog comes together from the PO sources and from the team sources. Otherwise, basically, you're a team that's just slaves to the PO, and that's not very sustainable in the long run. So that's another winning behavior. Work as close to the end users as possible. Otherwise, again, you're just like a shop on an island somewhere. You're isolated, a shop on an island. And the last one is, and you hear this from either teams that don't want to take on that don't want to do things, or from teams that need more training in Scrums, and there are no big stories, or there are no big chunks of work. I mean, the way you would in Scrum at least, or in any methodology for that matter, you would address a big story is either you can always practice more slicing, you can do time boxing, you can do spikes, you can even try parallel implementations, but don't take on big stories, and don't use that as an excuse not to do something. Chip away a chunk of a big story. That's for my winning behaviors. And now my question to Helena is, do I have minutes for the Scrum Master role, or do we go to questions from here?
Well, I guess I have to ask the community here. Quick chat. Do you want questions, or do you want Alexander to finish up?
Well, it's not really finishing up. It's optional material, which is
yeah. Do we have any comments from, or you can unmute if you want to ask.
Yeah, please.
I'd like Alexander to finish up. That's my vote.
All right.
We do have the Q&A session at 4 o'clock, so let's do it then. And if you have any questions, just write them in the chat and we can keep them for the afternoon. Go ahead, Alexander, you have 6 more minutes.
Wow, I don't think I'm going to use all of them actually, but I was just double checking. So what I've learned about the Scrum Master role, again, annotating the Scrum Guide. These are my 4 points that I would kind of like to nuance the Scrum Guide with. I think the first one is the most important, because it's hard to be a Scrum Master, to kind of, in a way, you can kind of speak of servant leadership and stuff like that, but in a way, somebody at least will kind of expect you to be, in a way, to a degree, responsible or accountable for how the team is doing. I mean, it is a role in Scrum, the purpose of which is to actually optimize the team, to have everybody do as good a job as possible. And if you don't know how software is built, I would argue that it's really hard to challenge your team, because you don't need to be the techiest and geekiest developer on the Scrum team, but you kind of need to have an understanding that there are like good user, I don't like the word requirements, like wishes or good ideas from users, and bad. There are the refinable ones or unrefined. You need to understand how software is deployed. You need to understand the role of testing, automation, DevOps, and stuff like that, how this comes together. Because if you don't at least have a fundamental understanding, it's really hard to challenge the team. It's hard to facilitate the retrospective, because I personally challenge the teams in the retrospective, for example, to see, is this really what we need to do to be faster the next sprint? You need some facilitation skills. You will be facilitating meetings. I recommend a short course or training on facilitation. You don't need to be a super facilitator, but you need to be able to run a meeting, a time-boxed meeting. You need to be able to interrupt people in a polite way. That's at least that's a minimum form. The next one, the Scrum Guide is a bit vague here, but there is, especially like back 5 years ago, there were more passages in the Scrum Guide saying the Scrum Master is part of like a larger community in the organization, which helps the agile implementation, helps bring Scrum to the organization. And to do that, it's just that something I've seen, you need some kind of mandate. You need to be listened to by people who are above you in the organization. So you need to have some kind of chip on your shoulder, or something to be invited into the right forum. Because if you've got the Scrum Master as a rotating role, it's hard to get invited to the forums where you can introduce Scrum, where you can promote agile way of work, etc. So I would say a Scrum Master needs some form of mandate. It's not the manager's mandate per se, but there needs to be a little chip on your shoulders. And lastly, you want to be a Scrum Master. That's why I know that a Scrum Master role can be a rotating role. You can do that kind of, but all the good Scrum Masters I've met kind of really, they had a, let's call it calling, or they like the role. You can mechanically facilitate meetings, run plannings, but it's so much better if you can give a bit of yourself. Last and least, but not least, sometimes I had to draw an iron triangle, the project manager triangle. Sometimes you end up in a hostile environment. And here's how it works. The better the Scrum Master, the better the team, and the more friendly the context, the better you will do. if you have a team that's plagued by conflict or is just super junior, if you've got a junior Scrum Master and you've got a context, an organization which doesn't really like the agile ways of working, or there is something toxic in the environment, I wish I could be scientific and draw some kind of lines here, but sometimes, I mean, if these dimensions of the triangle shrink too much, I would just say throw in the towel, do something else, change jobs. And I shouldn't, like, this would be my high note, ending on a high note, like change jobs. But I think it's a good high note as any. So if your iron triangle shrinks too much, you're in a bad context, your team doesn't want the stuff, you're not trained enough, call it a day, do something else.